The detention facility on Kepler Station buzzed with the usual mix of alien languages and mechanical hums. Guards from 3 different species patrolled the corridors, their weapons gleaming under the artificial lights. The station served as a neutral prison for war criminals from across the galaxy, housing the worst offenders from dozens of conflicts. In Cell Block 7, the most secure section of the facility, sat an unusual prisoner. Commander Marcus Kane looked nothing like the monster the galaxy believed him to be. At 73 years old, his hair had turned completely white, and deep lines marked his weathered face. His hands, once steady enough to pilot the fastest ships in human space, now trembled slightly from age and decades of captivity. The other prisoners gave him a wide berth, not out of respect but out of disgust. Everyone knew his story. 25 years ago, during the height of the Human Confederation War, Kane had been captured after the devastating Battle of Proxima 7. The official records painted him as a war criminal, responsible for the deaths of millions of alien civilians. The propaganda broadcasts that played throughout the prison reminded everyone daily of his supposed crimes. Kane never spoke about what really happened at Proxima 7. He sat in his cell, read the few books they allowed him, and counted the days. The guards treated him worse than the other prisoners, spitting on his food and accidentally bumping into him during transfers. The alien inmates whispered insults in their native tongues whenever he passed, knowing he understood more languages than they realized. Today felt different, though. A new group of Thrallaxian prisoners had arrived, veterans from a recent border skirmish with human forces. They were young, angry, and looking for someone to blame for their defeat. Word spread quickly through the prison that they planned to make the old human pay for their humiliation. Kane knew trouble was coming. He had survived this long by reading the signs, understanding the rhythm of prison life, but he was tired. Tired of the lies, tired of carrying the weight of secrets that could reshape the galaxy's understanding of the war. Most of all, he was tired of being painted as a villain when the truth was so much more complex. The Thrallaxian leader, a scarred warrior named Vextar, had been gathering support all week. His orange-scaled hide bore the ritual markings of a seasoned fighter, and his forearms made him particularly dangerous in close combat. He spoke loudly about human cowardice, about how their species had poisoned the minds of other races against the noble Thrallaxian people. Kane listened from his cell as Vextar's voice echoed through the block. The aliens' words stung not because they were cruel, but because they revealed how deeply the lies had taken root. The galaxy believed humans were monsters, genetic aberrations who had somehow stumbled into space travel and proceeded to corrupt everything they touched. Other prisoners began to gather, drawn by Vextar's passionate speeches. Species that had been enemies for centuries found common ground in their shared hatred of humanity. They spoke of human treachery, human weakness, human genetic inferiority. Kane had heard it all before, but tonight the words carried a different weight. Through his small window, Kane could see the stars. Somewhere out there, humanity continued its struggle for survival. The war had officially ended 15 years ago with the Treaty of Centauri, but Kane knew it was more of a surrender than a peace agreement. Humans had been relegated to a handful of systems, their expansion strictly controlled, their technology monitored. The galaxy had accepted the narrative that humans were the aggressors, that the war had been necessary to contain their violent expansion. Only a few people knew the truth about what had really started the conflict, and most of them were dead. Kane was one of the last living witnesses to the events that had shaped the current state of galactic politics. A guard approached his cell, a Zephyrian with blue-tinted skin and multiple eyes. "Old man," the guard hissed in accented standard, "your friends are planning a party for you tonight. Should be entertaining." Kane looked up from his book but said nothing. The guard waited for a response, then spat through the bars and walked away. This was how it always went. The guards baited him, hoping he would give them an excuse to use their shock sticks. Kane had learned long ago that silence was his best defense, but tonight would be different. As Kane sat in the growing darkness of his cell, he made a decision that would echo across the galaxy. For 25 years, he had kept his mouth shut, protecting secrets that weren't even his own. He had accepted the role of scapegoat, allowing his reputation to be destroyed to preserve a fragile peace. The sound of footsteps filled the corridor as prisoners began to move toward the common area for evening mealtime. Kane could hear Vextar's voice growing louder, More excited, the Thrillaxian was working the crowd into a frenzy, preparing them for whatever he had planned. Kane stood slowly, his joints protesting after hours of sitting on the hard bench that served as his bed. He walked to the small mirror bolted to his wall and looked at his reflection. The face staring back had seen too much, carried too many burdens, but beneath the aged exterior, something flickered to life. A spark of the man who had once commanded fleets, who had made impossible decisions in the heat of battle. Tonight, Marcus Kane would break his silence. The consequences would be catastrophic, but the truth had been buried long enough. As he prepared to leave his cell for what might be the last time, Kane allowed himself a bitter smile. The galaxy thought it knew the story of the Human Confederation War. They were about to learn how wrong they had been. The common area buzzed with tension as prisoners filed in for the evening meal. The usual segregation by species had broken down tonight, replaced by something more dangerous. Groups of aliens clustered together, their conversations focused on one topic: the old human in Cell 7. Kane entered the hall and immediately felt hundreds of eyes turn toward him. He moved slowly to the food line, his movements deliberate and careful. The serving drones dispensed the standard protein paste and synthetic vegetables without regard for species or reputation. Food was food, regardless of what the galaxy thought of you. Vextar's voice boomed across the hall. "Look at him," the Thrillaxian declared, his forearms gesturing dramatically. The butcher of Proxima 7 shuffling like a week-old fool. This is what the mighty human military produces. Pathetic creatures who grow frail and useless with age? A chorus of agreement rose from various corners of the room. Kane continued through the line, seemingly oblivious to the mounting hostility. He had learned to mask his emotions decades ago, a skill that had served him well during interrogations and now served him equally well in prison. An elderly Caraxian prisoner, his shell scarred from countless battles, spoke up from a nearby table. "I was there when the humans first made contact," he wheezed through his translator device. "Ugly little things, barely out of their home system. We should have exterminated them then, saved ourselves the trouble." Kane took his tray and began walking toward an empty table in the corner. The hall had grown quieter now, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Everyone sensed that something was about to happen, though none could predict exactly what. "My clutch brother died at Proxima 7, called out a young Saurian, his scales flashing angry red patterns. "Burned alive when this monster's ships opened fire on civilian transports." 20,000 innocents, including children? More voices joined in, each alien adding their own story of loss and suffering. The narrative was always the same: humans as the aggressors, aliens as the victims, and Marcus Kane as the symbol of human brutality. Kane had heard these accusations for decades, had seen the propaganda broadcasts that painted him as the architect of genocide. He sat down at his table and began eating methodically. The protein paste tasted like nothing, which was probably for the best. Around him, the temperature in the room continued to rise as more prisoners shared their grievances against humanity. Vextar stood on his chair, towering over the crowd. 25 years this creature has lived while better beings died, he announced. 25 years he has consumed food and breathed air that should belong to those he murdered. Tonight we correct this injustice. The crowd erupted in approval. Guards stationed around the perimeter made no move to intervene. Some were checking their communication devices. Others were looking in different directions entirely. The message was clear. Whatever happened next, they had not seen it. Kane continued eating, but his mind was racing through possibilities. He had survived this long by avoiding confrontation, by being invisible. But invisibility would not save him tonight, and perhaps it was time to stop trying. The weight of 25 years of silence pressed down on him like a physical force. A group of younger aliens began moving toward his table. They represented a dozen different species, united only by their hatred of humanity and their desire for revenge. Kane recognized the look in their eyes. He had seen it before, in the faces of soldiers on both sides of the war. This was the moment when reason died and violence took control. "Stand up, human," Vextar commanded as the group surrounded Kane's table. "Face us like the warrior you pretend to be." Kane took another spoonful of protein paste, chewed slowly, and swallowed. Then he looked up at the Thrillaxian leader with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations. "I am not pretending to be anything," he said quietly. "I am exactly what I appear to be, an old man eating his dinner. The crowd laughed at his apparent weakness. They saw submission in his calm demeanor, cowardice in his refusal to respond to their aggression. They could not see the storm building behind his weathered features, the careful calculation taking place beneath his seemingly passive exterior. "You murdered my people," snarled a Veltarian female, her tentacles writhing with emotion. "You destroyed our colonies, enslaved our children, poisoned our worlds with your human filth. And now you sit here feeding your disgusting face as if nothing happened." Kane set down his spoon and folded his hands on the table. The gesture seemed submissive, but those who knew how to read body language might have noticed the slight shift in his posture, the way his muscles tensed despite his apparent relaxation. "I have done many things in my life," Kane said, his voice carrying clearly despite its low volume. "Some I am proud of, others I regret deeply. But I have never murdered innocents, enslaved children, or poisoned worlds. You have me confused with someone else." The crowd roared with indignation. How dare he deny his crimes? How dare he sit there calmly while they recounted the horrors he had inflicted upon the galaxy? Vextar's scales shifted to a deeper orange, a sign of extreme agitation among his species. "Liar!" the Thrillaxian bellowed. "The records are clear. The evidence is overwhelming. You commanded the human fleet at Proxima 7. You gave the orders that resulted in the deaths of millions. The entire galaxy knows your crimes." Kane nodded slowly. "Yes," he agreed. "The entire galaxy knows the story they were told. But stories, my young friend, are not always the same as truth." The simple statement sent a ripple of confusion through the crowd. What was the old human implying? That the records were false? That the evidence had been fabricated? The idea was absurd, impossible. Too many witnesses, too much documentation, too many years of accepted history. But something in Kane's tone gave them pause. This was not the desperate denial of a guilty man trying to escape justice. This was something else entirely, something that made even the most hostile prisoners hesitate. Kane stood up slowly, his joints creaking audibly in the sudden silence. He was not a large man, had never been physically imposing even in his youth. But as he rose to face the crowd, something shifted in the atmosphere of the room. The old prisoner was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. For the first time in 25 years, Commander Marcus Kane was about to tell the truth. The dining hall had fallen into an eerie silence. Even the mechanical hums of the station's life support system seemed muted, as every being present focused on the frail human standing before them. Kane looked around the room, his gaze touching each face, each species represented in this collection of criminals and prisoners of war. "You want to know what really happened at Proxima 7? Kane asked, his voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone present. "You want to understand why I have spent 25 years in this cage, saying nothing, defending nothing?" Vextar's forearms trembled with rage. "We know what happened, monster. You slaughtered civilians. You committed genocide. I saved them," Kane interrupted, his words cutting through the Thrillaxian's accusations like a blade through silk. The simple statement hung in the air like a physical presence, impossible to ignore or dismiss. A younger Coraxian prisoner laughed harshly. "Save them? By burning their ships? By watching them die in the vacuum of space? What kind of salvation is that, human?" Kane turned toward the speaker, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes that made even the most hardened criminals take a step back. "The kind that prevents something far worse from happening," he replied. "The kind that stops a plague from spreading across the galaxy." The crowd stirred uneasily. Plague? What was the old human talking about? The official records made no mention of any disease, any biological threat that might have justified such extreme actions. But Kane continued speaking, his voice growing stronger with each word. "The ships at Proxima 7 were not carrying civilians," he said, his statement causing an immediate uproar. Dozens of voices rose in protest, calling him a liar, demanding he stop trying to rewrite history. Kane waited for the noise to die down before continuing. They were carrying something far more dangerous than any weapon the galaxy had ever seen, something that would have killed not just millions but billions, perhaps everything. A Zephyrian guard near the wall activated his communication device, probably reporting the unusual situation to his superiors. Kane noticed the movement but showed no concern. After 25 years of silence, he was finally ready to tell the truth, regardless of the consequences. "The Confederation Council knew," Kane continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "They all knew. The plague had started on Kepler Prime, in the research facilities where they were trying to create a biological weapon specifically designed to target human genetics. But like all such weapons, it mutated. The crowd had grown quieter now, drawn in despite themselves by the conviction in Kane's voice. Even Vexitar had stopped shouting, though his scales continued to display patterns of agitation and disbelief. Within 6 months, it had jumped species barriers 4 times, Kane said. First to the Altarian workers in the facility, then to the Caraxian security teams, then to the Saurian medical personnel who tried to treat the infected. By the time the research station went dark, 17 different species had shown susceptibility to the pathogen. An elderly Saurian prisoner near the back of the room shifted uncomfortably. Kane noticed the movement and nodded in his direction. "You remember, don't you, Healer Zakth? You were there when they brought the samples to your world. You saw what it did to your people in the laboratory tests." The Saurian's scales went pale, and he sank lower in his chair. Other prisoners turned to look at him, confusion and growing concern evident in their expressions. Zakth had never spoken of his past, had never explained why a healer had been imprisoned as a war criminal. The council's response was predictable, Kane continued. They decided to evacuate the infected populations to isolated systems, claiming it was a humanitarian relocation effort. But evacuation was just a cover story. They were planning to let the plague burn itself out, consuming entire populations if necessary to contain the spread. The hall erupted again, but this time the voices carried a different tone. Doubt was creeping in, replacing some of the certainty that had driven their anger. Kane waited patiently for quiet to return. Proxima 7 was the first evacuation site, he said. 12 million beings from 17 different worlds, all packed into transport ships, all unknowingly carrying a pathogen that would kill everything it touched. The plan was to let them settle on an isolated world, then declare the system off limits until the plague finished its work. Vexitar found his voice again. "Even if that were true," he growled, "it does not justify murder. You could have found another way, could have warned them, could have what?" Kane's voice cracked like a whip. "Could have let them land on Proxima 7 and establish colonies. Could have allowed the pathogen to mutate again, to find new vectors, new species to infect. Could have watched it spread to nearby systems through trade routes and communication relays." He began walking slowly around the room, his movements fluid despite his age. Guards tensed, hands moving to weapons, but Kane ignored them completely. His focus was entirely on the prisoners, on making them understand. "I spent 3 weeks trying to find alternatives," he said. 3 weeks analyzing the pathogen, consulting with human and alien experts, running simulations and models. Every scenario ended the same way. If those ships reached Proxima 7, if the passengers established even temporary colonies, the plague would spread beyond any hope of containment. A young Thrillaxian in the crowd spoke up, his voice uncertain. "The records show you opened fire without warning, without even attempting communication." Kane stopped walking and turned to face the speaker. "The records show what the council wanted them to show," he replied. "What they don't show is the 47 hours of communication between my fleet and the transport ships. What they don't show is my repeated attempts to convince the transport commanders to return to their home systems for decontamination procedures." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as the implications of Kane's words sank in. If what he was saying was true, then everything they believed about the Battle of Proxima 7 was a lie. Everything they believed about the war, about humans, about their own governments might be false. Kane saw the doubt in their faces and pressed his advantage. "The transport commanders had their orders from the council," he said. "Proceed to Proxima 7 at all costs. Establish colonies immediately. Resist any interference from human forces." They thought they were saving refugees. They had no idea they were carrying death itself. The old human stopped walking and stood in the center of the room, surrounded by hundreds of aliens who had spent decades hating him for crimes they believed he had committed. But now, for the first time in 25 years, Marcus Kane was ready to speak the 8 words that would shatter their understanding of everything they thought they knew. The words that would start a war. The silence in the dining hall was absolute now, broken only by the soft hum of air recyclers and the distant sounds of the station's normal operations. Kane stood in the center of the room like an ancient tree weathering a storm, his white hair catching the harsh artificial light. Around him, hundreds of prisoners waited for words that might change everything they believed about the war that had shaped their lives. Kane's eyes swept the crowd one final time, taking in faces from dozens of worlds, representatives of species that had fought and died in conflicts they thought they understood. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 25 years of enforced silence. "Your council ordered me to let them die." The 8 words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread through the crowd with devastating effect. Conversations erupted in a dozen languages as aliens turned to each other, seeking confirmation of what they had just heard. The implications were staggering, impossible to accept, yet somehow undeniably true. Bexitar's forearms flailed as he struggled to process the revelation. That cannot be," he stammered. "The council represents all our worlds, all our peoples. They would never, wouldn't they?" Kane's question cut through the Thrallaxians' protests. The same council that started a war to prevent human expansion, the same council that branded an entire species as genetic aberrations, the same council that has spent 30 years convincing the galaxy that humans are the greatest threat to galactic peace? A Caraxian veteran near the wall spoke up, his voice trembling with age and sudden uncertainty. "The plague you speak of. What happened to it? If it was so dangerous, where did it go?" Kane turned toward the speaker with something that might have been respect. Here was someone asking the right questions, someone willing to think beyond the comfortable lies they had all been told. "It burned itself out exactly as the council predicted," Kane replied. "When the transport ships were destroyed, the pathogen died with its hosts. No colonies were established. No secondary infections occurred. The galaxy was saved from a plague that could have wiped out life on thousands of worlds." The crowd stirred uneasily. If Kane was telling the truth, then his actions at Proxima 7 had not been genocide but the ultimate sacrifice. 12 million lives taken to save billions more, but the cost of that knowledge was devastating to everything they believed about their own governments. "You lie," snarled a young Saurian female, her scales flashing patterns of distress. "My nest mother was there. She saw the human ships open fire on defenseless transports. She recorded the massacre, sent the images back to our homeworld. There was no plague, no biological weapon, only human brutality." Kane nodded sadly. "Your nest mother recorded exactly what she was meant to see," he said. "A human fleet destroying civilian ships without apparent provocation. What she could not record was the pathogen spreading through the transport's life support systems. What she could not see was the mutations beginning in the cargo holds where the refugees were packed like animals." He paused, letting the image sink in before continuing. "By the time my fleet arrived at Proxima 7, 40% of the refugees were already dead or dying. The plague was accelerating, jumping between species faster than anyone had predicted. Within hours, it would have mutated again, become airborne, spread to my ships and then to every system we visited. The dining hall had become a courtroom now, with Kane serving as both defendant and prosecutor in a trial that had lasted 25 years. But instead of defending himself against accusations of war crimes, he was revealing crimes that went far deeper than anyone had imagined. "The council knew what would happen when they gave me those orders," Kane continued, his voice growing harder with each word. "They knew that destroying the transports would make me a monster in the eyes of the galaxy. They knew that humans would be blamed for genocide, that it would justify everything they planned to do to my species afterward." A communication device chimed softly from one of the guard stations, then another, and another. Word was spreading beyond the prison now, carried by automated monitoring systems and nervous security personnel. Kane's revelations were no longer contained within the walls of the detention facility. "But you followed those orders," Vextar said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You killed millions of innocents to prevent a possibility, a maybe, a disease that might have spread." "I killed millions of people who were already dying," Kane corrected, his tone gentler now. "I ended their suffering and prevented that suffering from consuming the galaxy. Yes, I followed those orders. And then I allowed myself to be captured, allowed myself to be put on trial, allowed myself to become the scapegoat for a war that was never about territory or resources or ideology." The truth was spreading through the crowd like wildfire now. Conversations erupted between species that had been enemies for decades. Comparisons of official histories that suddenly made no sense. recollections of events that took on new meaning in light of Kane's revelations. An elderly Altarian prisoner raised a trembling hand. His species was known for their meticulous record-keeping, their obsession with historical accuracy. "The biological research facility on Kepler Prime," he said in his soft musical voice. "The official records state it was destroyed by human saboteurs 3 months before Proxima 7. Kane smiled for the first time since entering the dining hall. The official records would say that, wouldn't they? Can't have the galaxy knowing that their own council was developing biological weapons. Much better to blame it on human terrorism. The Altarian's large eyes went wide. "I was part of the investigation team," he whispered. "We found evidence of human infiltration, human technology, human genetic markers in the debris. It was conclusive, overwhelming. It was planted," Kane said simply. "Every bit of it carefully placed by council agents to support the narrative they needed. The same narrative that justified the war, that explained the plague outbreak, that made humans responsible for every disaster that followed. The communication devices were chiming constantly now, creating a symphony of electronic alerts that spoke of growing chaos beyond the prison walls. News of Kane's statements was spreading through official channels, through prisoner networks, through the complex web of galactic communication that connected every world in known space. But Kane was not finished. 25 years of silence had created a reservoir of truth that would not be easily contained. He looked around the room one final time, meeting the eyes of beings who had hated him for decades, who were now beginning to understand the magnitude of the deception that had shaped their lives. "The war never ended," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the electronic chaos surrounding them. "It just changed forms. For 25 years, your council has been implementing the same plan they started with the plague. Isolate humanity, limit our expansion, control our technology, and wait for us to fade away into irrelevance." The dining hall erupted into chaos as the full implications of Kane's words finally sank in. If everything he said was true, then the peace treaty, the restrictions on human expansion, the monitoring of human technology, all of it was part of a genocidal plot that made the plague seem like a merciful alternative. And somewhere beyond the walls of Kepler Station, the galaxy was about to learn that the war crimes of Marcus, Kane, were nothing compared to the war crimes of the Confederation. Council, the old human prisoner, had finally broken his silence, and the galaxy would never be the same. The chaos in the dining hall was nothing compared to the storm brewing throughout the galaxy. Within hours of Kane's revelation, emergency sessions were being called in government chambers across dozens of worlds. The automated monitoring systems that had recorded every word of the confrontation were now distributing those words through channels that reached from the core worlds to the furthest colonial outposts. Kane sat calmly in his cell, having been escorted back after the prison authorities decided that leaving him in the common area might result in a riot, but it was too late for damage control. The truth had been released like radiation from a cracked reactor core, spreading invisibly but inexorably through every system it encountered. Outside his cell, he could hear guards speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Their conversations were in various alien languages, but Kane understood enough to know that panic was setting in among the prison staff. Orders were being countermanded, communication channels were being restricted, and transport schedules were being adjusted as various governments tried to control the narrative. But the narrative was no longer theirs to control. In the Altarian home system, Keeper of Records Veltar was pulling files that had been sealed for 30 years. Her species' obsession with documentation meant that even classified materials left traces in their archives. As she cross-referenced dates and events mentioned by Kane, disturbing patterns began to emerge. Supply requisitions that made no sense for a research facility, studying agricultural enhancement, personnel transfers that seemed designed to move key scientists away from Kepler Prime just before the outbreak. And most damning of all, a medical requisition for a pathogen, strain that matched the genetic markers found in the Proxima 7 debris. The Caraxian military archive experienced similar revelations as their strategists began reviewing battle reports from the war. Communications intercepts that had been dismissed as human propaganda suddenly took on new significance. References to biological containment protocols in human military transmissions. Emergency medical supplies being rushed to human fleet positions days before the Proxima 7 incident. And perhaps most disturbing, intercepted council communications that spoke of acceptable losses, in terms of millions rather than thousands. On Saros Prime, Healer Zakth had been transported from the prison back to his homeworld under heavy guard. But instead of being returned to confinement, he found himself in the chambers of the High Medical Council, facing questions about his role in the plague research that Kane had described. The elderly Saurian's resistance crumbled under the weight of evidence that his interrogators had gathered in just 6 hours. "Yes," he whispered, his healing tentacles trembling with age and fear. "Yes, I was there. I saw what the pathogen could do. I tried to warn them, tried to make them understand that evacuation was not enough. But they would not listen. They said the human fleet would handle containment. The implications spread like ripples through galactic society. If Kane was telling the truth about the plague, what else might be true? What other lies had their governments told them? What other sacrifices had been made in their name without their knowledge? On Earth, in the restricted sectors where humanity had been contained since the war's end, emergency broadcasts were reaching populations that had given up hope decades ago. The message was simple but revolutionary. Marcus Kane, the man they had believed was a war criminal, had actually been their greatest hero. The genocide they had been blamed for was actually salvation they had provided. And the peace they had accepted was actually a slow-motion extermination program. Human colonies that had been isolated for 25 years began establishing contact with each other for the first time since the Treaty of Centauri. Communication networks that had been dormant sparked back to life. And in hidden facilities that the Confederation had never found, weapons that had been mothballed since the war began emerging from storage. The response from the council chambers was swift and predictable. Emergency broadcasts declared Kane's statements to be the desperate lies of a convicted war criminal. Propaganda networks worked overtime to discredit every revelation, to provide alternative explanations for every piece of evidence. But the damage was already done. Too many people had access to records. Too many witnesses were still alive. Too many inconsistencies in the official story were becoming impossible to ignore. More damaging still were the aliens who began coming forward with their own testimonies. Scientists who had worked on the biological weapons project, military personnel who had helped stage the evidence against humanity, government officials who had been involved in the cover-up. Each revelation added weight to Kane's claims, making them impossible to dismiss as the ravings of a madman. Vextar, the Thrillaxian who had planned to kill Kane just hours earlier, now found himself in an interrogation chamber facing questions about his own unit's role in the war. The battle where he had been captured, the border skirmish he had claimed was unprovoked human aggression, was being re-examined in light of Kane's revelations. Communications intercepts suggested that his unit had been attacking civilian mining operations, exactly the kind of provocation that had been used throughout the war to justify Confederation responses. The prison itself was becoming a focal point for the growing unrest. Prisoners who had spent years hating Kane now found themselves questioning everything they believed about their own imprisonment. How many of them were actually war criminals? How many were scapegoats like Kane, taking the blame for actions their governments had secretly ordered or orchestrated? Guard units that had been loyal for decades began requesting transfers. Prison administrators found themselves dealing with staff shortages as personnel refused to report for duty. And in the most secure sections of the facility, other prisoners began sharing stories they had kept silent for years. But Kane himself remained silent again, having said everything he needed to say. He sat in his cell reading the same battered book he had been reading that morning, seemingly oblivious to the chaos his words had unleashed. When guards approached his cell with questions, he responded politely but offered nothing more than basic acknowledgement of their presence. The galaxy was tearing itself apart, trying to understand what had really happened during the war, and the man at the center of it all acted as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. In government chambers across dozens of worlds, emergency sessions were being called to address the crisis. Military units were being recalled from patrol duties. Trade agreements were being suspended. And in the deepest, most classified archives of the Confederation Council, orders were being prepared that had not been issued since the darkest days of the war. The old human prisoner had spoken 8 words that challenged everything the galaxy believed about itself. Now the galaxy would have to decide whether to face the truth those words revealed, or to silence them with the same brutality that had characterized the secret war against humanity. Either way, Marcus Kane's 25 years of silence were over, and the real war was about to begin. 6 months after Kane's revelation, the galaxy was unrecognizable. The Confederation Council had dissolved in a cascade of revelations and resignations that left dozens of worlds without central government. What had started as questions about a single battle had become an investigation into 3 decades of systematic deception, manipulation, and cover-ups that reached into every aspect of galactic society. Kane stood at the observation deck of the human battleship Defiance, watching as refugee ships from 17 different species approached the orbital stations around New Geneva. These were the survivors, the beings who had chosen truth over comfortable lies, who had abandoned their homeworlds rather than live under governments they could no longer trust. The irony was not lost on him. 25 years ago, he had destroyed transport ships to prevent a plague from spreading. Now he was watching similar ships arrive safely, carrying beings fleeing a different kind of infection, the corruption that had poisoned galactic civilization for generations. "Admiral Kane," said Captain Sarah Chen, approaching with a data pad in her hands. The title still felt strange to Kane after decades of imprisonment, but humanity needed experienced commanders, and his reputation had been transformed overnight from war criminal to savior. "The Altarian delegation has arrived. They're requesting an immediate meeting about the Archive Project." Kane nodded, still looking out at the stars. The Archive Project was ambitious even by human standards, a comprehensive effort to collect, verify, and disseminate the truth about the war and its aftermath. Every classified document, every suppressed report, every hidden recording was being gathered from across the galaxy by beings who had finally decided that truth was more important than political convenience. "What about the Council remnants?" Kane asked. "Any word from their new stronghold in the Centauri sector?" Chen's expression darkened. "They've issued another declaration. They're calling us a rogue terrorist organization and claiming that all the evidence we've presented is fabricated human propaganda. They're also mobilizing what's left of their military forces." Kane was not surprised. The truth was devastating to those who had built their power on lies, and desperate beings were capable of desperate actions. The former council members who had escaped the initial investigations were now gathered in a handful of heavily fortified systems, protected by military units that either believed their version of events or were too compromised to switch sides. "They're planning something big," Kane observed. "You don't mobilize entire fleets just to issue propaganda statements. What does our intelligence suggest?" "Multiple sources indicate they're planning a preemptive strike against Earth," Chen replied. "They believe that if they can destroy the human homeworld and eliminate our leadership, they can rewrite the narrative again. Paint us as the aggressors who started a new war based on fabricated evidence." Kane finally turned away from the observation deck, his weathered face showing the weight of decisions he had hoped never to make again. "How many ships do they have?" "Approximately 800 vessels from 12 different species," Chen said. "Not as large as the fleets from the original war, but still formidable. And they're being led by some of the same commanders who fought against us 30 years ago." The old admiral walked slowly toward the bridge, his mind already working through tactical possibilities. Around him, the ship hummed with activity, as crew members from 6 different species worked together in ways that would have been impossible just months earlier. The crisis had created unexpected alliances, bringing together beings who had been enemies for generations. "Admiral," called out Lieutenant Zakron, a young Saurian who had defected from the Council forces after learning the truth about his species' role in the biological weapons program. "We're receiving a priority transmission from the Caraxian Free Fleet. Admiral Thexvar reports that Council forces have begun moving toward the Sol system." Kane nodded grimly. The Caraxian Free Fleet was composed of ships whose crews had mutinied against their government after learning about their leaders' complicity in the Plague Project. They were now serving as scouts and early warning systems for the growing coalition of truth seekers. "Time to Sol?" Kane asked. "At current velocities, approximately 72 hours, Zakron replied. Kane looked around the bridge at the faces of beings who had risked everything to stand with humanity in its quest for justice. Altarians whose government had branded them traitors. Thrillaxians who had been exiled from their homeworlds, Saurians who faced execution if they were ever captured by Council forces. They had all chosen truth over safety, principle over comfort. "Send a message to all coalition forces," Kane ordered. "Full mobilization. All available ships to rendezvous at the Luna staging area within 60 hours. And send a priority transmission to Earth Command. Tell them that Marcus Kane is coming home." The bridge erupted in controlled activity as orders were relayed across the galaxy. Ships that had been hiding in neutral systems began moving towards Sol. Weapons that had been secretly manufactured in hidden facilities were brought online, and on dozens of worlds, resistance cells that had been waiting for this moment began emerging from the shadows. The Council's plan was predictable, but dangerous. They would arrive at Earth with overwhelming force, destroy the human homeworld, and then claim that humanity had started a new war by fabricating evidence against the galactic government. With Earth gone and human leadership eliminated, they could rewrite history once again, ensuring that their version of events became the official truth. But they had made a crucial miscalculation. The truth about the plague, about Proxima 7, about the systematic oppression of humanity had not come from human sources alone. It had been confirmed by alien scientists, alien historians, alien survivors who had finally found the courage to speak. Destroying Earth would not destroy the evidence, and killing humans would not silence the alien voices that had joined their cause. As the Defiance and its escort fleet began their journey toward humanity's homeworld, Kane reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. He had started as a young officer protecting human colonies from alien aggression. He had become a war criminal blamed for genocide. He had spent 25 years in prison, accepting the role of scapegoat to preserve a fragile peace. And now, at 73 years old, he was once again an admiral, commanding not just human ships but vessels crewed by beings from across the galaxy. The communication panel chimed with an incoming message. Kane activated the display and found himself looking at the face of President Maria Santos, the leader of the Reformed Human Colonial Alliance. "Admiral Kane," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the light years between them. "I wanted to personally thank you for everything you've sacrificed for our species, and I wanted you to know that Earth stands ready. Whatever the Council throws at us, we'll face it together." Kane smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Madam President," he replied, 30 years ago I made a promise to protect humanity from those who would destroy us. I intend to keep that promise." The transmission ended, leaving Kane alone with his thoughts as the fleet continued its journey toward Earth. Behind them, hundreds of ships from dozens of species followed, united by a common cause that transcended the old boundaries of race and nationality. Ahead of them lay the Council's forces, desperate to preserve their power through one final act of destruction. But Marcus Kane had broken his silence, and the truth could not be silenced again. The galaxy had chosen sides not based on species or territory, but based on principle, and for the first time in 30 years, humanity would not face its enemies alone. The old human prisoner had become the admiral of a liberation fleet, and the war that had never really ended was about to reach its true conclusion. In the depths of space, two philosophies prepared for their final confrontation: those who believed that power justified any lie, and those who believed that truth was worth any sacrifice. The galaxy would soon learn which philosophy was stronger,